welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Sean Kirkland. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation.
Dr. Kirkland recently published 2 books, Heidegger's Destruction of Aristotle, published by Northwestern University Press, July 2023, and Aristotle and Tragic Temporality, accepted for publication by the University of Edinburgh Press. He's also involved in translating Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. I understand that one of the common elements here is the interest that these German philosophers had in Greek tragedy. So tell us about Greek tragedy, and let's get into why this was so important to them.
Sure. Well, Greek tragedy was a art form that emerged in the 6th century BCE. And the legend has it that Thespis is the first tragic Greek actor who stepped out of the Dionysian ritual dancing chorus and addressed them. And from that point on, we had something like a tragic drama that took place in ancient Greece. And in the middle of the 6th century, Presocratics institutes the Greater Dionysia as a sort of a major annual festival that takes place in Athens. And it becomes a really central fixture of democratic Athens after Cleisthenes' reforms in 508 BC and throughout the Periclean Athens of the kind of classical age. Tragedy is a central cultural power and force in Greek tragedy. And I think one of the most fascinating aspects of Greek tragedy for later thinkers and late modern thinkers was the simple fact that it presented really difficult truths about the human condition to a mass audience, to the entire citizenry, if not the entire population of Athens on a yearly basis. And so there's something kind of fascinating, I think, for these late modern thinkers and in particular German thinkers about a culture that featured tragic art as a central part of its civic life.
Right. I guess the key to this, though, is this Dionysian tradition here, which then is explored and challenged during the period of the tragedy history.
Sure.
So just a little bit more on that. So this is sort of a tradition of celebrating basic human urges here, right? This is their Woodstock, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, what would you see prior to the development of the tragic period here?
Sure. Well, so there were ritualistic events that would take place in worship of Dionysus.
And festival-like atmosphere,
Yeah, in festival-like atmosphere where that would involve dancing and singing and chanting and sort of very energetic ritual activities.
Yeah, and lots of good wine.
And apparently a lot of good wine and maybe some other substances.
They were drinking Racina.
Yeah, I don't know if they had Racina.
Lavrodaphne.
Yeah, they definitely. Maybe mixed at a smaller ratio than they would in more staid circumstances.
Okay.
But they would have these Dionysian rituals that involved a pretty wild expression of human emotion and energy, really. Yeah. And so when that becomes sort of redirected into something like a Greek tragedy.
But Greek culture at this time is becoming a little more structured,
sure.
Right? And this Dionysian ritual is a little less accepted, right?
Sure, there's at least a kind of a wariness about it. But at the same time, I think one of the fascinating things about the ancient Greeks is that they made a place for the worship of this god. He's part of their pantheon.
Right.
Dionysus does represent the unruly and the disorderly and the wild. And so those sides of the human experience, drunkenness and kind of a breakdown of social order. And he represents those things really fundamentally, and yet he's part of the Greek pantheon. He's not sort of he's central to their kind of their religious world.
Right.
And so that gets sort of taken in and directed into Greek tragedy. And in any Greek tragedy, then you would have the actors on stage. Once we have, say, Aeschylus at the beginning, the oldest tragedy we have is Persians, that remains, is the Persians of Aeschylus, performed in Athens in 472. And so from that point on, you would have either 2 or 3 actors performing on stage a plot that everyone in the audience already knew. It was a Greek myth. And then you would have the chorus dancing around in the orchestra and sort of reacting to the events on stage. And it's those 2 elements that are integrated into Greek tragedy that were so fascinating for Nietzsche ultimately, as a kind of...
because the drama was now questioning this behavior and causing people to think about it and try to justify it and things like that.
Sure,
right?
and they had and there was a kind of a tension there with the drama unfolding on stage, where you had very powerful figures like Oedipus or Agamemnon or other kind of tragic heroes, Creon or Antigone. And they would be trying to control their circumstances, trying to engineer success and happiness for themselves under fraught circumstances. And then you would have the chorus, which represented something of that Dionysian experience of the world that sort of subtended the logical unfolding of the narrative on stage. And so there is that tension between the two, and that's what Nietzsche found so fascinating about tragedy. How were the Greek tragedians able to harmonize those 2 elements of the Dionysian choral experience and then the Apollonian or sort of logical, rational structure on stage?
Which was sort of a result of the influence of Plato. Right?
Sure. Eventually, then, we could say that kind of the 5th century in Athens saw a kind of move toward a greater rationalization. So with Socrates and Euripides, the 3rd of the great, so we have Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides being the kind of 3 great tragedians of the 5th century. By the time you get to Euripides, we have a kind of a Socratic demand for explanation.
Right.
So there's less of a sort of tolerance for what's mysterious or maybe groundless or maybe inaccessible in the world of human experience. And we have, with the emergence of Socrates the philosopher and Euripides the tragedian, the imperative that everything should be explained, everything should be rationally accounted for in principle. If we should be able to give explanations of everything under the sun. And that becomes sort of the philosophical imperative that dominates Western culture for the rest of the development of civilization in the West for Nietzsche, looking back in the 19th century.
So Nietzsche feels that we're too constrained.
Right.
And so he goes back to this period and tries to explain and understand what kind of forces were active there and wants to re-release those forces, right?
In a way, yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. I think he thinks he's got a sort of a double project from early on in his career. So 1872 is when he publishes The Birth of Tragedy out of the Spirit of Music. And that's his first book. And so from then on, through the next 17 years, he's only writing as a philosopher for 17 years.
Although he's not a philosopher, right?
Not really a philosopher, not trained as a philosopher.
His background is...
Classics, some philology, So study of ancient Greek and Roman literature and poetry and philosophy to some extent, but really exclusive to Greek and Latin. So when Nietzsche looks back at that ancient Greek moment, he's critical of his contemporary German culture. He sees things to admire in that Greek moment. And historical context and in the culture of the Greeks. He doesn't want to repeat that, but he wants to explain the way in which his culture and his values and the concepts they used in 19th century Germany eventually emerged out of that original Greek moment and sort of haven't been thoroughly and profoundly questioned since. And so he's sort of trying to destabilize his status quo in order to maybe allow for something like a return of a tragic creative impulse as something parallel to, we might say, what the Greeks experienced.
And he talks about the morality of the dominant person and the morality of the person who's dominated, right?
Sure.
How does that work into this?
Yeah, so by 1887, so a number of years later in Nietzsche's career, he publishes a book called The Genealogy of Morals, which is the first essay in there compares these two, a master morality and a slave morality. And there, Nietzsche's trying to do another sort of what he would call a genealogical genealogy, which is a destabilizing return to origins.
Yeah.
So when Nietzsche wants to criticize the dominant Christian morality of his day, because he feels that it's become oppressive, because it imposes a kind of shamefulness about very ordinary, fundamental human desires and experiences,
Yeah.
and just about a shamefulness about being in a body, about having a body. He sees this as kind of imposing a lot of harm and suffering on believers. And so he wants to trace the emergence of that Judeo-Christian morality back to its original context, which he sees as a reaction to a dominant Roman culture and a dominant Roman master morality.
Yeah.
And he sees it invented as a kind of defense mechanism against that oppression. And in that moment, he thinks that's an amazingly powerful invention that Judeo-Christian sort of population came up with to defend themselves against this, justifiably against this oppressive force. He just thinks then it became fixed, it became absolute.
So he appreciates it at its origin,
Yep,
right?
yep.
But doesn't appreciate that it becomes fixed
kind
and
of an
repressive.
unquestionable truth. Nietzsche hates a winner is kind of the lesson. He just, anything that sort of wins and becomes dominant, he thinks that's a problem. It should always be understood as something that's emerging out of an experience that's excessive and not yet ordered by the concepts and values that it will create.
Of course, one of the famous quotes is, "God is dead."
Sure, yeah.
How does he get to that point?
Yeah, so that is a kind of
He wants God to be dead.
Well,
more like, right? What he's.
I don't know. Yeah, that's a.
It's not an observation he made, I hope.
No, it's sort of. I think what he is diagnosing there. He wants to say something very provocative and very that will provoke a strong reaction among his readers.
Yeah.
And when he says God is dead, he doesn't. He means more that every single fundamental principle that the entire history of the West has established, on which it could ground its moral values, on which it could ground its epistemology, its ability to know the world, and on which it could ground its understanding of being itself, that is God in the Middle Ages, and then ultimately something like reason or the rationality of science in, say, the modern period, or even nature in the Romantic period. For all of those are instances of God, that fundamental principle that we believe we can establish and ground ourselves on.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not sure if he wants God to be dead, but I think he thinks at his historical moment, toward the end of the 19th century, those principles have kind of run out of gas.
They're vacuous at this point, right? God's not behind them anymore.
Yep, exactly. And now he's saying, if we want to establish a healthy, vibrant culture, we can't pretend that that's not the case. We have to figure out a way to invent new gods or invent new values, invent new interpretations of reality, new philosophies that are fundamentally sort of in excess of the history we inherit. And he realizes that takes a lot of energy, but he's hoping that he can be a part of kind of preparing people for that really onerous project of creating new values.
Now, he is sometimes cited as kind of creating the philosophical basis for the Nazis and for a lot of the things that they tried to justify during World War II. To what extent does he deserve that reputation?
Well, it's a complicated question. On the one hand, it's certainly the case that Nietzsche is vociferously anti-Semitic. He sees the anti-Semitic trends and tendencies of his contemporaries, and he
Right.
finds them despicable
Right.
and stupid, just groundlessly, thoughtlessly stupid.
Yeah.
And so he's very critical of those, including those of the anti-Semitism of Richard Wagner, who was of such an influence on Nietzsche
Right.
from 66 when Nietzsche meets, 1866 to 1873 or 4 when they sort of break, or slightly after that. But at any rate, so Nietzsche's very critical of that general anti-Semitism in German culture of his time. So we can't lay that at his
No,
doorstep.
but they do, go into Greece and these
Yes.
other countries, and they
Sure.
slaughter
Yep.
civilians when they feel like it,
Yes.
because they feel that they're superior, right? And there is some.
Yep, that's certainly right. And
Yeah.
Nietzsche did give his successors this notion of the Übermensch, the individual who is strong enough to cast off the traditional and oppressive values that they inherit.
Right.
And strong enough to create new values. And Nietzsche thinks that should be a figure that inspires and energizes us. What he doesn't think is that anyone who claims to be that individual is a reality. I think
Right.
he doesn't. He
This is an
wouldn't.
intellectual exercise for him.
Exactly. It's a motivating figure. I think it always stands at the sort of futural horizon of the creative act that Nietzsche thinks we have to be able to engage in. But that being said, also he certainly did, in casting off traditional morality, allow for the kind of rationalism, dehumanizing rationalism of National Socialism
Right.
that allowed them to set aside normal or established moral constraints
Right.
that would have stopped them from treating human beings as inhuman.
Yeah.
And so he's certainly part of the late modern, postmodern criticism of those traditional values. And he did certainly at certain moments engage in kind of a glorification of power and the exercise of power.
Yeah.
So that can be traced. We can see a through line from Nietzsche to some of the worst parts of National Socialism.
Yeah. And what's Heidegger's role in all of this?
Yeah, so to my mind, Heidegger is a kind of a Nietzschean with a better understanding of the history of philosophy. So Heidegger also sees the Greek, ancient Greek moment as the kind of the historical context out of which our most fundamental concepts and values are invented and established,
Yeah.
and that then passes along those values and concepts through the Middle Ages, through the early modern period, to the late modern period, to 20th century Heidegger's context. And he sees that historical arc as sort of coming to an end in his 20th century period. So he's in lockstep with Nietzsche in that kind of diagnosis.
Yeah. As
Heidegger,
opposed
yep.
to a teleological
Yep.
view of things.
Exactly,
Yeah.
where we could imagine that things are getting better, or that
Right.
things are progressing toward an ultimate culmination because of an overseeing sort of benevolent force in history or something like that. Heidegger and Nietzsche both see our Western culture as having been stamped definitively in the ancient Greek period, and then unfolding down to the late modern period that both of them inherit. And what they see in this moment, our moment, is the necessity of thinking in excess of that tradition.
Right.
And the
Because it's now no longer
functioning
well,
properly,
yeah.
and it seems to have become oppressive and insufficient in various ways for thinking the problems that we're facing. We've become suspicious of some of our most fundamental concepts and values. And so for both of them, the challenge is how we begin thinking in excess of that tradition we've now diagnosed as insufficient if we don't have any other concepts or values ready to hand.
So I'm curious about what they might have thought about the Presocratics, because
Sure.
Plato really kind of sends Western civilization off in this direction, right?
Yep.
He says, let's just talk about things we can prove.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
But the Presocratics were looking for theories that had explanatory power, and they weren't necessarily limited by what they could prove. They just they were interested in things and looking at things in very different ways, right?
Yep, that's right.
So does he see them as a model for what we should be like today?
Yeah, and I like this idea of kind of explanatory power versus sort of complete justification or something, totalizing justification, which I think is what Socrates and Plato are demanding. And I think you're absolutely right about that. And both, so Nietzsche publishes this early text after he publishes Birth of Tragedy in 1873. He doesn't publish, but he writes and then kind of abandons partway through a book called Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, which is a study of what for him are the pre-Platonic philosophers. So it's from Thales through Heraclitus, Parmenides, up to Socrates.
Yeah.
And he sees them all as thinking the world and trying to invent concepts that are sufficient, that explain that experience, but before the profile of the philosopher has been established. So he kind of thinks the profile of the philosopher gets established really with Plato and Plato's Academy. Then we have kind of a set understanding of what the philosophical...
They were called sophists. They were rhetoricians.
And we have people like Pythagoras, who seems like maybe a cult leader, but they're all... I think the fascinating thing for Nietzsche is that those...
If I were around then, I would have followed Pythagoras very closely. I'm just saying, you know.
To get on board for vegetarianism, but those figures are kind of immediately, for Nietzsche, immediately responding to the world, kind of like raw nerves, and then out of that deep, immersed experience, they're trying to think new concepts that don't exist yet. And I think he thinks that's a fascinating philosophical moment. And there is a sense that we shouldn't emulate the Presocratics, but we shouldn't think what the Presocratics think, but we should try to think how.
Like they think,
how the Presocratics think.
That's good. So there wasn't anyone in that group that he was particularly interested in then.
Heraclitus he says I think it's in Ecce Homo, he says, there's no one in whose company I've ever felt more comfortable than Heraclitus.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And what did he like about Heraclitus?
Well, Heraclitus was famously, the most famous sort of expression we associate with Heraclitus is panta rei, which means in Greek, everything flows. And Heraclitus's fundamental insight was that even when things seem fixed and stable and persisting, they are actually always changing and in a constant state of emergence. And Nietzsche thought that dynamism was something that he wanted us to be able to think in relation to.
So myth had an important role in this too. Let's get into that a little bit.
Sure. I think for the Greeks, I think we can easily misunderstand the role or the status of myth in ancient Greek culture. For us, with our kind of scientistic attitude, we look at myth as fiction. It's kind of a making up stories about the world. But for the Greeks, those myths were meant to have explanatory power. They were meant to account for the world and to make it intelligible. But the crucial difference that I think both Nietzsche and Heidegger appreciated about that status of myth for the Greeks is that mythical discourse gives an account of the world and means to explain the world without claiming to exhaustively illuminate it. So it shows you how the world is. It lets the world appear in this mythical mode, but it doesn't claim to exhaustively illuminate it, to rid it of all mystery. It allows it to retain some mystery, and that's just essential to mythical discourse as such, I would say.
Were there any periods in history that Nietzsche looked at that he thought this period was interesting here because they were testing the boundaries a little bit?
Sure.
I think of the 1960s. Of course, he didn't know about that.
Not yet. No.
But he might have appreciated some of that.
I think he would have. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You know, I think for Nietzsche, in this early period when he's really focused on the ancient Greeks, I think there was that the 6th and 5th century. I think he sees that as a kind of remarkably energetic moment. I think for him in the 19th century, there's two phenomena that he thinks suggest a kind of energetic capacity to reorient ourselves in a really radical way.
Yeah.
One is Wagnerian opera. He thinks the great increasing popularity of Wagnerian opera and its profound power to introduce myths to a people who are deeply embedded in the musical experience.
Of course, yeah, right.
So he thinks Wagnerian opera suggests maybe something like this. And I think there is a parallel there with the 1960s, a kind of a political probably Wagner wouldn't have liked anything I think that was going on in the 60s, but the profound power of music at least is there. Right. And then Schopenhauer and Kant and their philosophical suggestion that maybe human understanding has to draw a limit and suggest that it can master and explain the world that appears to us, but that it has to abandon hoping to access things in themselves, things as they truly are. And so that kind of setting a limit to the power of human understanding, Nietzsche thinks that as a return of the Dionysian. So for him, Kant was, however unexpectedly, a Dionysian.
He was. I don't think Kant would like that.
No, I certainly wouldn't, yeah.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Sean Kirkland for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.